I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I am your host, Jesse Lawler, excited to bring you yet another episode of the podcast devoted to the betterment of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. We are on episode number 39. And this is going to be a really interesting one. We're going to be talking about ketosis and the brain. Ketosis, for those of you who are not aware, is a special state that the brain gets into when it is burning what's known as ketone bodies derived from fat rather than glucose, its typical fuel. And there are those who say that there are lots of benefits associated with having your brain in ketosis for at least part of the time. We're going to be talking with Dr. Emily Deans, who is a recognized authority on this subject. And then, if you hang around until the end of the episode, we're going to tell you how some stock traders are using nootropics to make more money in the stock market. I should also forewarn that in the coming interview, I get the domain name for Dr. Emily Dean's website incorrect. I say that it is evolutionarypsychiatry.com, but it is actually evolutionarypsychiatry.blogspot.com. But I'll be sure to get it right in the show notes on the Smart Drug Smarts website, but I did want to put that out there in advance. But before we go into any of that, let's do This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
So you may remember a few episodes ago when we interviewed Dr. David Nutt from the UK. Basically, that episode was centered around some of the UK's what we felt were fairly silly policies on disallowing study of the potential medicinal uses of drugs that are classified as recreational drugs. Among them was psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. Well, apparently these same bureaucratic hurdles are not slowing down people at the University of Zurich, which just last month published a study on psilocybin, and basically the highlights are that psilocybin is found to inhibit the processing of negative emotions in the brain. Psilocybin positively influences mood in healthy individuals by stimulating the docking sites for the chemical messenger serotonin, which has mood-brightening effects. Says Dr. Rainier Krahenmann, even a moderate dose of psilocybin weakens the processing of negative stimuli by modifying amygdala activity in the limbic system as well as in other associated brain regions. According to the doctor, this observation is of major clinical importance. Depressive patients in particular react more to negative stimuli and their thoughts often revolve around negative contents. So the potential for neuropharmacologists to use this now proven capacity of psilocybin to potentially come up with some new antidepressive drugs is very real. And of course, at least at the University of Zurich, research is continuing. And in news that personally raises my serotonin levels without the help of psilocybin, got 2 new iTunes reviews, both 5 stars. Carlito474 says, "Thank you, Jesse, for doing a sleep show with Dr. Winter. I'm in a polysomnography program and have been studying many aspects of sleep for years and learned new things about how to prevent jet lag." I also tried that how to prevent jet lag tip that Dr. Winter gave in the sleep episode, and yeah, I did find that was strangely effective. Yeah, go back and check that episode out if you haven't had a chance. Everybody sleeps, so I think everybody should listen to that episode. And Gus2366 said, "Great podcast. I've just started into looking into supplements to improve my mental cognition, so this is a great way to get some knowledge on the latest supplements. I only wish that the program was longer." Well, thanks, Gus and Carlito. And now the moment you've all been waiting for, the main interview. Again, this is Dr. Emily Deans of Evolutionary Psychiatry and a longtime brain researcher, blogger, and sort of promoter of some of the ideas that some very out-of-the-mainstream dietary options might be better for our bodies and brains.
Smart Drug Smarts.
Our body in general, the metabolism has 3 sort of fuels that we can burn. There's fatty acids, obviously, glucose, obviously, but sort of the third dark horse that not everybody knows about are these ketones, which are little fragments that your mitochondria can burn when there's not enough glucose around. And the interesting thing about the brain, and why for a long, long time they sort of said that basically you can't survive on less than 100 grams of glucose a day, because that's kind of what your brain will burn during the day, is that your brain does have a higher requirement for glucose than the rest of your body. The rest of our body can burn, except for our red blood cells, the rest of our body can burn both ketones and fatty acids pretty readily. But the brain can really only burn glucose, specifically the astrocytes. And there are these long tendrils that just don't have room for our mitochondria, which is our engines of our cells. So they can only get power via what's called glycolysis.
Interesting. So these are mitochondria-free cells within the brain?
No, they have mitochondria, but there's pieces of them that are very, very long tendrils.
I see. Okay, gotcha.
So this is why the brain has an absolute glucose requirement. Now, as humans, we are able to take our protein and our muscles and we're also able to take the backbones of fatty acid molecules and turn it into glucose, because there's a glycerol backbone to a fatty acid molecule. And so we're never gonna just totally run out of glucose. You drop dead if that happened. But the interesting thing about the brain is that if you can kind of run on that low edge of glucose, as little glucose as you can use, and have mostly ketones being burned, it tends to change the metabolism of the brain a little bit. And there are elements of it that actually, the mitochondria seem to burn ketones a bit more efficiently than they burn glucose. So there's a lot of mystery as to why ketosis does what it does, what exactly it does in the brain, how things are burned in the brain. There's a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot of speculation more, I think, than what we know. But one of the pretty sure things we know is that it does seem to increase mitochondrial efficiency, and that is probably the key to why ketosis does what it does.
And sort of when we scale up to sort of the macro level of an organism, what sort of effects are we seeing when we say it does what it does? What does it do? What does a person whose brain is in ketosis feel like versus everybody else?
Ketosis is a state that we get into naturally if we are starving. So if we don't have anything to eat and really you can get it, everyone with a healthy metabolism goes into ketosis overnight. Mm-hmm. So most people wake up in the morning, if you have a good metabolism, in a bit of ketosis. That happens because your breath is a little bit gross and maybe your urine smells a little bit strong, and that you can smell sometimes a little bit of the acetone that can be a byproduct of ketosis. Okay. Now, that can be a very dangerous thing in something called diabetic ketoacidosis, which is what happens to diabetics if they have totally untreated diabetes. They get into this wildly out of control ketosis. That's very, very different to our ketosis that we can just have from being on a very low carbohydrate, low glucose diet, or that we get just from going on a fast. And that is a physiologic ketosis. It's much lower levels than you see in a diabetic ketoacidosis, and it's not dangerous at all. So what happens is that the brain seems to burn a little bit more efficiently, and some people notice that they just think clearer, that they're sharper, that instead of that energy that you get from sugar, when you eat sugar, you might feel sort of really high and happy and energy and do cartwheels in the backyard and feel woo-woo. But then a couple hours later, you just kind of crash and you feel dull and foggy and gross. So people will say with ketosis, if they stay in ketosis, you can have this nice, steady burn of energy. It's kind of, one would be diesel, like ketosis would be diesel, and glucose would be more like gasoline,
Gotcha. To bring an automotive analogy to the brain.
Right, just to say that there's just two alternative fuels. We have sort of a hybrid engine that's able to burn both of them.
Yeah. Is ketosis versus not in ketosis, is it like a all or nothing thing? Or is a person clearly in ketosis or not, or is it sort of a sliding scale on a spectrum?
I've sort of seen it both ways, where people sort of say you're either, which I think they really mean is keto adapted versus not. Your body will, in your muscles, you will burn glucose before you burn anything else in general. That's what you'll see sort of in a cell if you have it in a petri dish. It'll burn glucose and then it'll burn fatty acids.
Right.
When you look at physiology, we're always burning a blend of fuels. And people will be in a deep, deep ketosis, which is if you fasted for 4 days. Or there's actually a supplement called ketone esters that you can take that puts you instantly into deep ketosis. Or if you take these supplements called MCT oils, which are present in coconut oil, they will also preferentially be metabolized into ketones. So even if you eat some carbohydrate with it, with some glucose in it, you'll have more ketones floating around in your body. So I really tend to think of it more as a continuum, where there's some people in sort of deep ketosis and other people sort of in a much more mild ketosis. Your brain, though, I think you sort of have to be at a certain level before you're going to feel that it's a ketosis that kind of feels different. And if anybody's done a fast, if anybody's done a 24-hour fast or any of that kind of thing, it's sort of that afternoon, you'll start to really feel quite different. The afternoon of your fast, if the last time you ate was the night before. And when they do, what you do need deep ketosis for is it's used as a treatment for intractable epilepsy that doesn't respond to anti-epileptic drugs. And they need what they would often start off with in the hospital when they were first studying this.
Yes, the really extreme diets.
They would start with a 4-day fast. So to get people into a deep ketosis. And that's quite an extreme level of ketosis.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, that would be the diets where they're basically eating sticks of butter and margarine, and it just sounds as unpalatable as anything could possibly be.
It was nasty. I mean, a lot of these kids were very, very ill, so they might be tube fed or something like that, because they'd be born with cerebral palsy and maybe intractable seizures. So they'd be tube fed anyway. So they just have these keto feeding things that are soybean oil and MCT oil, and hardly any less than 30 grams of carbohydrates a day, which is pretty hard to do and eat anything besides heavy cream and soybean oil. So that would be a deep ketosis. What we've discovered, I think, and what the ketone esters, which are kind of they're not really available. They're barely available for research, but the ketone esters, I think, will enable people to experiment with ketosis and eat almost a sort of a normal diet. Right now, you can play around with the MCT oil and experience higher ketosis, and that's what they're doing now with kids who have certain seizure disorders, and they want to be in ketogenic diets. They'll have them on a much more relaxed, what's called a modified Atkins diet, and maybe add some MCT oil so that they can have the benefits of ketosis without all the restrictions and have a more varied diet, which it can be a problem. It's hard if you really ketogenic. It's hard to get all your vitamins and minerals. It tends to suppress the appetite. Mm-hmm. So, for kids, this is a big issue because they don't grow as readily, and you of things like kidney stones and things like that. So a highly ketotic, sort of old-fashioned diet, I think it's kind of a risky pharmacologic sort of maneuver. You really need to know what you're doing. But with some of the MCT oils and other stuff like that, I think it can be a lot safer.
Nowadays, it seems like with our normal carbohydrate-heavy diets, being in ketosis is probably a pretty rare state for people. You run a blog called Evolutionary Psychiatry, and I know that things that you're thinking is based on is evolutionarily, where were we coming from? What was our ancestral environment like? Ancestrally, do you think that early humans were in ketosis a whole lot more than they are now?
I don't know. What I would say is there's probably definitely people who are just snacking on Skittles all day long, like we seem to do now, and crackers and popcorn and all of these processed carbs that we have. I think, ancestral humans, they sort of thrived in all sorts of different environments. And, but I would say it's probably fair to say that certainly people experienced hunger for longer periods of time, perhaps more often than we might, certainly now. And that they might have had a week of fasting every now and again when they just weren't able, when they didn't have a good hunt or whatever it was. And that is actually how I tend to look at ketosis in general. there's some people who live in ketosis or have to live in ketosis because they do it for seizures, or people sometimes do it for dementia because there's some evidence it's helpful. I know there's some case studies in the literature of people doing it for bipolar disorder. Because these same sort of anti-seizure effects can help decrease the mood swings from mania to depression that happens in bipolar disorder. So those people, because of these neurological disorders, traumatic brain injury, there's evidence for as well, they kind of live in ketosis. Mm-hmm. But I don't know that living in ketosis would be if we're sort of looking for the optimization of human health.
Right.
I don't know that living in ketosis would do that, because I tend to think of these situations as sort of what we would call hormesis. Have you heard of that term?
Yeah. In the book Anti-Fragile, he talks a lot about that, how basically occasionally shocking your system with something that we think of that would be bad actually kind of builds up your immunity to frequent applications of that same thing. Like, if you're a baby that never has exposure to germs, then you don't bother to develop an immune system, that sort of thing.
Right. So it's sort of the idea that it happens all the time. So radiation actually is the right amount of radiation, a sort of normal amount of cosmic radiation we might get from the sun and the atmosphere is good for us, and it causes us to sort of go in a state of repair and regeneration. But radiation that you would get from standing inside Fukushima, it would kill you.
Right.
So that's way too much, because it just totally goes through your DNA and rips it apart. Another example of that are antioxidants. So antioxidants are actually toxins in high amounts. So resveratrol and all of these antioxidants that seem to inspire us. All this, is this the next wonder drug, or is this the next wonder thing? Let's take, 10 times the amount of vitamin E that we should, because it's an antioxidant. What we sort of think of as antioxidants are actually poisons, like radiation. And in small amounts, though, it inspires our bodies to do recovery and regeneration and repair. And it actually has us make our own antioxidants like glutathione in much greater amounts, and causes our mitochondria to maybe shift from going full out, let's go row, or energy, to saying, okay, let's kind of hold back. Let's sort of recover. Let's, send this cell. It looks kind of bad. We'll send it into cell death. We'll make a nice new fresh cell to replace it. Mm-hmm. So these are all little signals that kind of tell our body to say, hold on, back off. Let's kind of come back and repair. So to use another analogy, if our body is like a horse, if we're just going, racing pulling a chariot behind us all the time, eventually we get worn out and we'll don't do so well. And we need every now and again to go out to the green pasture and get a rub down and get some recovery and feel good. So hormesis is one of these, they're stressors at the right amount, at the right place, at the right time that make us stronger. And I think, the way I think of ketosis is kind of like that. I think in the past it would have been a little bit every night, mild ketosis, maybe a deep ketosis every once in a while that tells our body, what, we're kind of low on fuel here, we're low on resources, let's conserve, let's recover. And so having these hits every once in a while, so fasts every once in a while, ketosis every once in a while, I think that may be how we're evolved, and that may be the most optimal way to go about it. But that's kind of just my guess.
It does make some certain sense, though, because, we are cyclical creatures in a lot of ways. It's like we are on a planet that has night and day, and we've had these diurnal cycles, forever, that everything on planet Earth has evolved with. And there's not like one state that a being should be in constantly, like a light bulb or something that's just always on.
Right. And I think there's something to be said for seasonal variations in how we eat, that perhaps in the wintertime we wouldn't have had, as many carbohydrates. It'd be more protein and fat, whereas in the summertime you might have lots of fruits, starchy tubers. The fall, the potatoes come in. And certainly potatoes weren't a necessarily ancestral food, but we've been eating starchy tubers and carbohydrates for a long time. So that tends to be how I think of it, is that it may be everyone should do a fast every once in a while. That may be the healthiest thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like rebooting your computer or something. So what's your diet like? Obviously you spend a heck of a lot of time thinking about this sort of thing, researching it. And how do you apply this to your own life and your family's?
Well, I tend to eat a paleo style diet. So I generally avoid bread. In most grains. I have rice every once in a while. I'm not that low carb. And this is something that I've seen in my practice, and then talking to a lot of people and people who comment on my blog. Some people thrive on a super low carb, and some people thrive on ketosis. They just feel really alive. They don't have hunger. They don't have cravings. They're very healthy. They do very well. But I've seen some people get very tense and obsessive and sort of skinny and dehydrated looking. I don't know how to describe it exactly, but they also seem to feel after a while sluggish and very stressed. For me, just kind of a personal thing, it tends to, even when I've been keto adapted for a while, because I've tried it, obviously, I've tried it for probably 6 or 8 weeks at a time. And I just get really stressed in the afternoon, and my feet get very cold.
Interesting.
Because ketosis is a stress and it can kick in a cortisol response. And I think you have to think about that in terms of what else is going on in your life. Are you getting enough sleep? Are you getting, and I was also doing a lot of exercise when I was experimenting with ketosis was a lot of glycolytic work that really doesn't mix well with ketosis. So lots of high intensity exercise and things like that. You're really better off using carbohydrates for that. You just feel better. Endurance exercise, I think, responds well to ketosis, but for competition, people tend to carb up for that and do better.
Yeah.
So my diet is kind of a moderate carb, paleo style diet. Lots, I don't eat out all that often, do a lot of my own cooking, lots of vegetables, not as many fruits, vegetables, starchy tubers, bananas, a little bit of rice, and lots of chicken and beef and fish.
I'm so happy to hear you throw bananas in there, because I'm a big banana fan myself, but I know that bananas, sometimes people poo-poo them for having too many sugars.
Yeah, they're a nice, cheap source of starch and some sugar, but they also have lots of vitamins in them, choline, potassium. So I don't like to poo-poo any kind of sort of real food that has tons of nutrients and minerals with it, whether it's high carb, low carb, or in between. I tend to prefer, I really don't like processed food, and I really don't like processed carbs and what it does to the brain. Because I just think what the world would look like if we didn't have these processed carbs. I mean, because people are all crashing at 3:00. They're driving home, either, drinking their Red Bulls or not their diet Red Bulls, but the sugar Red Bulls, just to keep their blood sugar levels up. And the rest of them who haven't have road rage. And I don't know, I just think we would be much less moody and all over the place if it weren't for the processed carbs. That's kind of my personal opinion.
One of the things that people that are sort of, into ketosis and thinking about this oftentimes goes hand in hand with the idea of intermittent fasting, of, restrict eating hours to like a small slice of the day when you kind of jam all your eating between, like, let's say, noon and 8 p.m. or something like that, and try to make sure that you're in a ketotic state for maybe the 6 or 8 hours before your eating period starts. What's your thought on that, intermittent fasting? And I guess sort of like for people that might be doing something like that, the timing of when they want to be in ketosis, when they want to be asleep, and when they might be doing, their exercise within that cycle.
Most people I know who experiment with that have most success with, I've seen people do it 2 ways. And I'm really speaking sort of from anecdotes, not from any kind of scientific, papers or anything like that. Just so
you're a doctor. Well, we'll see what you say.
Yeah, it's a dangerous way to think.
Yeah.
Anecdotes can really mislead us. But I would say most people skip breakfast because a lot of people aren't hungry in the morning anyway, right? And it's easier to skip breakfast than dinner, probably, because nobody likes to go to sleep hungry. And I do think, there's some evidence and some research that a little bit of carbing up right before dinner helps people sleep better, because it helps serotonin enter the brain, or tryptophan enter the brain to be made into serotonin that's made into melatonin. So there's something to be said for carbing up a little bit before bed for a nice night's sleep. And some people in ketosis, they do complain about they can't really sleep. They're just kind of tense and wired all the time. So I would say for an intermittent fasting, a lot of people, it's easier for them to wake up in the morning, skip breakfast, then go maybe do their workout, and then go off to work, and then not eat until noon. Maybe have some coffee with cream, or some people do the bulletproof coffee with the MCT oil to kind of keep them in their ketosis. It's sort of
get some calories, but only fat calories, essentially.
Yeah, only fat calories won't kick you out of ketosis. It'll it's really only the carbohydrate and the protein calories that will tend to kick you out of ketosis. And protein is hard to do. It's hard to eat enough protein to kick you that much out of it. But that's kind of the easiest way. I know some other people that felt it was more successful for them, they were trying to do intermittent fasting to lose weight, to skip dinner, to eat. That's when people snack and have less control over what they take in. So they would eat breakfast and lunch and then skip dinner. I've also seen.
That sounds like it would be hard socially. Like it'd really be hard to maintain a social life never having dinner.
Well, there are also people who do it. They might do it 5 days a week, or or people do 24-hour fasts 1 day or 2 days a week as intermittent fasting. So. And I used to do that. I used to fast on Mondays because it would make me kind of grouchy, and I was grouchy on Mondays anyway. So it just helped me get my work done.
That's so efficient if you're going to be grouchy anyway.
Right. So I was like, I'll just not eat until dinner on Monday, and I would be really busy at work, so the day would go by pretty quickly. But that's when my feet would get very, very cold, and I figured that was a good sign. So. That is, I certainly wouldn't intermittent fast and then go out on a 150-mile bike ride if you're not used to ketosis without any kind of, you wouldn't want to bonk. You got to be careful with that kind of thing. But with just a normal day and maybe a short HIIT workout in the morning and things like that, I think it works fine. One other thing that I've seen, Martin Birkin of, what was his name, Lean Gains. Have you heard of him?
I've heard of Lean Gains. I didn't know the guy's name, but
he puts I think one of his training regimens is he puts people on intermittent fast every day, but he's noticed that women do better with a 14-hour fasting window, and men can tolerate a 16-hour fasting window. This is something else that I have seen as well. Men seem to tolerate low carb and very low carb better than women, and I don't know why.
Well, typically, isn't conventional wisdom that a healthy male should have a fairly significant amount less body fat than a healthy female?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's so. And if we sort of think about physiologically in evolution, women were primarily the gatherers, so we would be out there getting the starchy tubers and possibly...
And you were probably snacking on it before you brought it back to camp.
Yeah, you'd have to cook the tubers, but if we saw some greens or fruits or whatever, you would eat them, as you would bring it back. So they would be more likely to be snacking all day, whereas men might be more off. They would certainly be collecting stuff they saw along the way as well. They might be eating more of in big meals. So it may be that men are just a little bit designed differently. Obviously, men's metabolisms are different than mine. My husband can just not eat Doritos for 3 weeks and lose weight, and he's like, oh, that was the best diet ever. If I even look at a Dorito, I'll gain 10 pounds. So so men's and women's metabolisms are quite different, and I think that this ketosis and the fasting is part of that, because it's just something women seem to get more stressed on it and just don't tolerate it as well. But having said that, I do know some women who thrive in ketosis.
One more just oddball thing. I'm wondering if you've heard of a guy named Owsley Stanley. This is you heard this guy?
I don't think so. I might have. I'm terrible with names.
No problem. But apparently this is true. So this guy was like somehow affiliated with the Grateful Dead, and he was a guy that made a huge amount of LSD back during the 1960s. But what's interesting about him is for like 50 years of his life, did not eat any vegetables. He was on a totally meat diet. He, for some reason, had something against vegetables, but apparently was quite healthy and like died at like 75 years old in a car accident. And he didn't even die of any physical cause, but just went decade after decade after decade eating nothing but meat. And I just heard that, and I thought that was just what a weird thing that's actually possible.
I know of a woman, very, very bright woman, who's totally controlled her bipolar disorder with just a meat diet. Mm-hmm. And I had a friend who visited them, and they said, oh, what do you want for dinner? And my friend said, I don't know, what do you have? And she goes, well, if it's meat, we have it. So they just eat meat. And then another friend of mine who's a psychiatrist had lots of food intolerances and problems, and she did much, much better on pretty much a meat diet and vegetables. Because of her food intolerances, vegetables cause problems. So, and she was months at a time, meat. And meat has a lot of fat in it. You have to eat fatty meat to do this.
Sure.
You can't just eat boneless, skinless chicken breast. That's not going to work because that's way too much protein. You need quite a bit. So you need to eat the fatty meats. You need to eat the organ meats. But
what about things like, you hear that dietary fiber is necessary, but as I understand it, fiber is something you only get from vegetable sources. But maybe I'm wrong. You tell me.
That's an interesting question, and I think that's one that's up for debate. I think that soluble fibers and some of the things that we get in vegetables and fruits that would have been, it's definitely part of the human diet and something that we've evolved eating. I think that there's a role for them, and they feed our microbiota in particular. And that may be our healthiest optimum. That would be another danger of long-term ketogenic diets, is sort of seeing, because our microbiota change significantly depending on our diet. It tends, and you'll read papers say, oh, it's a dangerous change because we've changed to these other microbes, these classes and families of microbes that seem to digest protein and fat better. But I think that's sort of this is dangerous, but I don't think it's a dangerous thing. I think it's not it seems obvious that if you're eating mostly protein and fat, that your microbiota would change to what would digest protein and fat better.
Yeah,
but it's considered bad in the medical in the literature when you read the papers. But I don't know. But there is certainly, your microbiota do change. And I don't know if you follow the paleosphere much. There's this whole resistant starch movement. People talking about that and feeding their microbiota, that low carb is bad for you. And I kind of back off to this sort of agnostic stance. And then, but also maybe we should be doing shifts, cycles. So I know so many people with GERD, or I've heard of so many people with gastroesophageal reflux disease who went low carb, and it cured their gastroesophageal reflux disease. And then when they started to add carbs back in, it didn't come back as long as they were, judicious about it. And I think what that did was killed off the bad part of their microbiota that was causing the reflux, or the overgrowth that might have been causing reflux. And then, when they're by line and they started adding some more carbs, it came back online in a better situation than it was before. So I think that's something that we really don't know. Is long-term ketosis dangerous because it starves your microbiota? I think there's pluses or minuses for thinking about that.
Well, cool. Any sort of final last words of wit or wisdom? Really interesting talking with you.
Health comes from moving. I think it comes from getting a nice amount of sleep. I think it comes from being outside in nature quite a bit. I also heard this from a guy, Dr. Logan, really smart guy who studies the microbiota. And he said to me, there is no health without mental health. And so I do think that we prioritize mental health more, and learn more about some of these things, because who cares if you have a healthy heart, if you're psychotic or you're demented,
Sure.
Early on. So I think, we do need to think of our brains as a very important organ in our body, maybe the most important organ. Got to take care of it. Eat well, sleep well, experiment with ketosis, but be careful.
So thank you very much to Dr. Emily Deans for all of her insights into all things fatty and ketotic. That's some really interesting information. And it sounds like it's a very not one-size-fits-all set of dietary recommendations, but definitely something that might be worth playing around with in your own diet, seeing what ketosis feels like for you, how your body and brain reacts to it. Not necessarily a smart drug per se, but it felt like it was worthy of an episode to kind of delve into that, because it's definitely something that you're putting into yourself that's having a massive effect on your brain chemistry and presumably your cognition as well. So drop me an email if you do some serious ketosis experimentation and let me know how it goes. That email, of course, would be jesse@smartdrugsmarts.com. And now, the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Okay, so this is the tip of a larger iceberg, because I actually want to do an episode about this. But if you guys remember back to one of the very early episodes of Smart Drug Smarts, I feel like this was like episode 6 or 7, and we interviewed a neurologist named Dr. Andrew Hill out in Los Angeles, who was forming up a company at that time called TrueBrain. And this was TrueBrain has been around for, I guess, probably about a year and a half now. So meanwhile, across the United States, one of the partners at a company called Sanglucci Capital Partners, a stock trading firm on Wall Street, heard that episode of Smart Drug Smarts, got in touch with Andrew Hill, and in spring of this year brought a bunch of traders across the country to do simulated stock and options trades while on TrueBrain versus while on a placebo, and see how they performed in both cases while hooked up to EEGs and reading the electrical activity from within their brains in real time. So they got coverage on this on Bloomberg.com. I'm going to put a link up on the Smart Drug Smarts page for this episode, but I want to devote a full episode towards really digging in and seeing what went on in this study. So consider this a preview of future episodes to come. You heard it. That is the episode. If you liked what you heard, please recommend this podcast to your friends and or leave us a review on iTunes. Those of you who noticed that I promised something that would be like a kitchen cabinet, help your brain avoid dementia recommendation, and then heard this episode and was like, wait, that wasn't what Jesse was talking about, was it? Yes, we rearranged the order of a couple of episodes. However, the aforementioned or hinted at episode actually is recorded. Yeah, well, we should have that one up pretty soon. That'll be number 40. And episode number 41, going to be recording in just about 48 hours time. It's going to be our first ever three-way conversation on a Smart Drug Smarts episode. So doing all kinds of new funky stuff as we hit the 40-something episode numbers. The show notes for this episode will be online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that I talked about here. And I will be back at you next week, approximately the same time, on exactly the same podcast, with an unchanged and unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.